and thanks everybody for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Geeta Prasad. I'm an assistant professor in our Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emily Grubert, who's going to be giving the DeFord lecture today. Dr. Grubert is arguably one of the most creative interdisciplinary thinkers of my acquaintance. And I think that is reflected in her current job title. So currently, she's an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame in sustainable energy policy and civil and environmental engineering and earth science. She started off actually getting her master's here at UT Austin in the Weber Group. She has both a master's from the Environmental and Water Resources Engineering program and the Energy and Earth Resources program here at UT. She then went on to do her PhD at Stanford in Adam Brandt's group in environment and resources. And prior to her position at Notre Dame, she worked for a few years at the Department of Energy, helping lead their carbon management program. So she really brings a broad wealth of training and thinking to the work that she's doing right now. And I think that you will see that reflected in the talk that she's going to give us today. So take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And yeah, it's really nice to be back. I haven't actually been in this room for a super long time. So thank you all for coming out and spending some of your afternoon with me. As Geeta mentioned, my name's Emily Grubert. I'm up at Notre Dame up in Indiana and working a lot on what I've been calling the mid-transition for the last little while. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to think about the energy transition, specifically in the context of decarbonization, with a very infrastructure-oriented approach, and really what that means for a lot of what we do on both kind of the policy and research side. So that's a lot of where this is going to go today. Cool. So I think the fundamental point, and I'm sure a lot of people have at least thought about this before, especially in this room, is that when we think about reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which is fundamentally what we generally believe needs to happen in order to stabilize the climate, that means closing or fundamentally remaking about 80% of the commercial energy system worldwide. That's the piece of the energy system that is fossil fuel based. That is the part that drives carbon emissions, including a lot of methane emissions as well. But when we think about what energy transition means, this is not so much about a little bit of change here and there, kind of typical business as usual technology turnover. This is fundamentally reorienting a lot of how we think about our industrial systems and the energy systems that support all of the services that we use. As just one example, and I think that one of the reasons why I tend to use a lot of maps and tend to think a lot about infrastructure is partially because I'm a civil engineer, but also partially because I think it's really instructive to think about what it is that we're talking about in a very concrete way. So I'm going to use mostly US examples today. But what this map is essentially showing is where all of the fossil-fired power generators in the United States are. The legend is basically red is natural gas plants, blacks are coal plants, the few green ones are the ones that are dominantly using petroleum-based fuels, which we don't really use for power. But just as a point of context, this is the infrastructure that we need to, again, either close or really dramatically remake if we are to decarbonize the electricity system. The colors of the counties behind this is basically a representation of how much labor is associated with running the power plants. In the golds, mining coal, which is the blacks and grays, and then the pinks are kind of an approximation of where the gas is probably coming from. So I won't talk about that a ton in detail, but I think the main point that I want to make with a map like this is a huge amount of infrastructure. It's well distributed around where people live in particular. It's very much embedded into the way that we handle jobs, industries, etc. But we have a massive advantage in the context of transition in that we know this. The very nice thing about existing infrastructure is we know where it is, we know how old it is, we know who works there, we know what kinds of characteristics it has. And so when we really start to think about deeply infrastructurally based policy, especially around transition, thinking what that means very concretely and not that abstractly is possible. When we start talking about all the other stuff we need to do, so what we need to build to replace these systems, That's also something we can do. It's something we spend a lot of time modeling, but it's a lot more abstract in some ways. So we can make resource curves. We can think about where the best opportunities might be. We can conduct community engagement to see who might be willing to host these facilities. But there's a lot of uncertainty that in these cases, again, we know what we're dealing with. That doesn't make this process easy by any means, but I think when we really start to get down to thinking about what is it that we need to do and what do we need to believe if we are actually going to succeed at some of these things, recognizing the massive advantage that we have in understanding what we're talking about and being able to use that to make decisions, I think is fairly critical. So, for example, in a lot of my work, I think about things like retirement deadlines that give people planning horizons. In the case of a power plant, if you can say something along the lines of, a steam plant typically lasts for about 50 years, what would it look like to require all of the steam plants to close when they're 50 years old? And what can we tell the community in advance? How do we know how much time we have? Like, you can really start to get into some much more concrete ideation, particularly in kind of democratically governed processes like this. So overall point being, it's a ton of infrastructure, but we have a lot of information about it. This applies in a lot of different contexts. Power, again, is not easy, but we're talking about kind of 10,000 generators or so. Once you start to move into some of the other things that are fossil-based, this gets much more difficult. So just a general picture of cars, basically. But I think one of the things that stands out when we start thinking about what transition really means and what we need to do in order to make this work is, again, kind of going back to that question of what would we need to be doing now if we actually were going to succeed with some of the deadlines we're talking about. So in the United States, we talk about reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. That's also kind of the global goal. So from an equity and justice perspective, you could probably argue that this should be much faster in the United States. But what that looks like is probably really addressing our single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, which for now in the United States is transportation. How many people in here have driven a car that's more than 20 years old? Well, yeah, so some, right? Like, these are not assets that turn over that quickly. It's not like it's a power plant where it lasts 50 years, maybe a little bit longer, but it's not the kind of thing where we can say we want to be net zero by 2050, so we'll stop selling gas cars in 2049. These are the kinds of things where you actually do have an opportunity to think about them ahead of time. That's a hard thing to do. It actually requires really standing up and making that decision and committing to it. These are things that affect people's lives very deeply, but it's also something where when we kind of think about the logical consequences of the types of emissions trajectories that we're committing to, there's a lot of opportunities to really observe a bunch of other issues that we know how to solve, but maybe haven't addressed that directly. So for example, with the transportation system, so I want to be done with gas cars by 2050. Maybe that means I stop selling gas cars by 2030 in this environment, or I have some way of saying I'm going to buy you out of your gas car by 2050 if you have one that's a little bit newer than that, something along those lines. That's one piece of this puzzle. It's something we're starting to see in state policies in some cases. So California is talking about a 2035 deadline for purchasing gas-fueled cars. A bunch of other states are signing on to that through some exceptions and exemptions within the Clean Air Act structures. That's interesting, but there's other questions around this too, like what starts to happen to gas stations, which are mostly privately owned, franchised, et cetera, if they aren't profitable anymore? How do we think about whether there's a role to play regulatorily in requiring some of them to stay open, even if they're not profitable? Is that something we need to do? If we don't do that, do you start to see a bunch of gas stations just collapsing all of a sudden, and now the people that still do drive gasoline vehicles aren't able to get to work anymore? Are those people more likely to be poor? There's a lot of questions like this that we absolutely have the tools to answer, but we haven't really started asking yet. But I think, again, really thinking about this from a very infrastructure-focused perspective starts to unlock a lot of these questions and really forces some of those opportunities to think about how we could do this differently. The other big one, so we kind of have the power sector, we have transportation, and now heating is the other really, really significant piece of the decarbonization puzzle that poses a lot of challenges. So what this map is showing is the dominant heating fuel by, I want to say county or county equivalent in the United States. And what you see is that you've got yellows are the electricity, the darker golds are wood, mostly in more rural places. The kind of bluey purple is propane. So very interestingly, a de-networked gas source in very cold places, so you don't necessarily need a pipeline network to support propane. And then the rest of it, these like darker purple colors, are mostly natural gas. And then we've got fuel oil up in the Northeast, which is a little bit of an outlier from a regional perspective. But what stands out to me, at least immediately about this map, and probably stands out to you as well, is that the fossil fuel users, or the direct fossil fuel users, are in the cold places. There's a lot of reasons for that, particularly with the way that our electricity system works right now. It's much, much cheaper to use fossil fuels directly than to use fossil fuels that have been turned into electricity and then use them resistively in a heater in your home. I will say most of these yellow areas are using resistive heat rather than like a very efficient mechanism like a heat pump. That's changing a little bit, but that's largely why you see these in more mild climates. As we start thinking about transition, this kind of issue, the heating issue in particular, again, engages this infrastructure question, but at a household level, and also very critically at an extremely sensitive part of the system, in that if you don't have heat, that is deadly. You actually need to make sure that you know what you're doing when thinking about transitioning these systems. And so, again, thinking about this from an infrastructure perspective, how do we address questions of how you keep these very cold places warm in the winter if we're moving mostly to heat pump systems? Are we sure those systems work? Are we sure that we have backups when they fail, like warming centers and things like that? But this is another one of these things that does not happen overnight, but is a solvable question. You put all these together and start to get a lot of other interesting questions, like what actually are you depending on from an infrastructure perspective as you transition? So notably, in a case like this, if you've decarbonized the power sector and you started to move away from natural gas heating or something like that in a house, but you're still using some natural gas, where is that natural gas coming from? How is it getting there? Do you actually have eyes on your pipelines? Do you have people that are maintaining those pipelines, and who's paying for that? But a lot of these very infrastructural questions are not necessarily hard, especially from kind of a science, engineering, and management perspective. They're hard politically to enact, but they are things that we actually could answer. And I think as a research community, we have a really important opportunity to start addressing some of them. Cool. So to introduce a term that I started this talk off with, one of the things that I think is actually kind of important as just a framing element for a lot of this is that decarbonization includes what I, with a colleague, Sarah Hastings-Simon at the University of Calgary, have been calling the mid-transition, which is a period where you have both carbon-based systems and zero carbon-based systems. They're both big enough to constrain each other, but too small to actually cover all of the kinds of services that you need. So you have this intermediary period where you're actually needing to probably maladapt each system to accommodate the other one a little bit. We're probably not quite in the mid-transition at this point in a lot of cases because the fossil fuel system remains dominant enough that you don't really need to change how you're operating it in order to accommodate renewables, for example. That's not true everywhere. We do know that like natural gas power plants probably have to do more ramping than they would otherwise in places that have high renewable penetration. But those kinds of constraints happen when you are a little further along transition than we see, for example, in the transportation sector. These are hard problems, and they're things that if you fail, you actually have services not being provided anymore. So the power goes out, your heat goes out, things like this. So really thinking about how a lot of these interactions are coordinated and who is doing that coordination and how, I think, is kind of one of the major challenges of making all of this work. To kind of make that point a little bit more deeply, during this mid-transition period, which based on some early evidence kind of looks like it's around when you have one system at least 20% of the system and then the other system up to about 80%, so that kind of 20 to 80 trade-off zone. Based on what we can tell from where we actually see constraints, that seems to be relatively where this might be. This is a period when the carbon and the non-carbon based systems actually do constrain each other. And I think that's kind of a key point about this that makes it different from just talking about transition in general. This is something where you do have to have both systems accommodating each other that is probably harder than the stable points on either end. So once you get to a fully decarbonized system, you can optimize around the needs of that decarbonized system. When you're in a mostly carbon-based system, you can optimize around those needs. But there's this middle period that might be several decades long where that's not true and where you probably need different metrics, different management techniques, these kinds of things. So it's probably going to get harder before it gets easier is kind of one of the points here. This is a directional process. So one system is shrinking, the other is growing. Within the context of how we run our energy systems now, this is actually kind of an interesting and challenging problem because it means that you are relying on one system, the shrinking system, in a way that is also not really encouraging a lot of investment in that system. It's not encouraging a lot of people to work in that system. It's not necessarily looking like an attractive long-term career prospect, these types of things. That's a really hard thing to do, particularly when you're talking about high hazard industries where you really need people that know what they're doing and are on their A game all the time as this happens, particularly because the transition probably means that operating those systems gets harder as you start to have to accommodate the other system, in addition to having to deal with climate change. So this is a directional and dynamic thing where you have big changes in not just the attractiveness of either industry, but also the level of investment people are willing to make, those types of things that really, again, starts to become a management problem very quickly. Again, this is probably something that takes decades, even if we go as fast as we possibly can. So the good version of this is, success by 2050, essentially. That's about, 27 years now. That's really fast for these kinds of infrastructure challenges. But even this really remarkably fast transition is still basically a working lifespan. And so thinking about what that actually looks like in terms of not just how we operate the systems, but again, how we encourage people to engage with them is really, I think, a big question that, again, we have not really spent that much time thinking about, but it is a solvable and answerable thing that probably engages a lot of governance questions. I think one of the other interesting characteristics of these mid-transition concepts is that different parts of the energy system enter and exit it at different points. So what this map is kind of showing is that we're further along into the transition, at least in the United States, on the electricity side. There are some states that are starting to see greater than 20% modern renewable penetration, for example. Not everyone is. So this is kind of characterized as green is fully renewable, red is fully fossil-based on the power sector. The middle part is kind of this orangey color up to this lighter green. And so you do see a few states that are really, Texas included, that are starting to cross into that threshold where you really have to think about these management issues. And in those places, we do see evidence that there is this accommodative maladaptation occurring. So solar curtailment, really fast natural gas plant ramping, like those kinds of things are the types of constraints that we're starting to talk about. But sort of interestingly, also because it's news this week, we're also starting to see impacts of this transition on the way that we think about metrics. So the Energy Information Administration, I think on Monday, I want to say, announced that they're going to be changing the way that they account for primary energy from renewables. Historically, in order to make the data kind of work and to not mess up the averages, because we've always been able to assume a thermally dominated system, they've kind of counted renewables as though they have a heat rate that's equivalent to the rest of the thermal system. They announced earlier this week that that's no longer working. It's making the statistics get kind of complicated because there's now enough renewables on the system. So they'll go back to a fully heat-based version of it. It's a really wonky side note, but we're starting to see things like that where we're realizing that the metrics we have are no longer fit for purpose for this transitory period. Another thing that I wanted to just kind of lay out, you can think about decarbonization in many, many ways, but the way that I think about it, and one thing that I think is actually really important for thinking about transition, is to recognize a couple of pretty dominant processes here. So one being deindustrialization, and the other being industrialization. We have to close things, and we also have to build things, and we have to do that at the same time while making sure the system is actually still functioning and providing life-critical services in many cases. In this context, and from a policy perspective in particular, we talk a ton about the benefits of industrialization. New industries, new jobs, new access to modern technologies, those kinds of things. It's a very popular way to approach this from a policy perspective. And similarly, we talk a lot about the benefits of decarbonization. So you slow down climate change, you probably get a lot of co-benefits in terms of air pollutants, water use, solid waste generation, those types of things. But what we don't really do is talk about, first of all, the disbenefits of industrialization. We are starting to really have to grapple with the fact that people are concerned about building out massive new pieces of infrastructure associated with the decarbonization transition. So like big new wind farms, things like that. We generally don't talk about deindustrialization at all. That's a pretty unpopular thing to do from a political perspective, to basically show up and say, look, this plant is going to close, how do we deal with that? But it's a really important conversation to have. And then we really don't talk very much at all also about how we manage this middle transition period, which again, may take decades. This is not the kind of thing where you're asking people to sort of hold on for 6 months and then we'll be through it. This is something where you need to bring along a couple of generations of people as we do it and kind of keep normatively moving in one direction. So this is a really challenging set of things that is not really that widely discussed in a policy context and probably points to some opportunities to think about this differently. I would argue in general that we probably need to start talking about the energy system much more from a service provision perspective than kind of an overall technology one. So how do we make sure that people know they're going to have access to the services that we need? But there's a lot of different ways we could think about it. Overall point being, there's a lot of this conversation we haven't really had yet, and I think that's part of the challenge of why we haven't been moving as quickly as we probably need to. So in this overall context, one of the kind of core questions here is how do you actually facilitate a transition away from fossil fuels that is just and really has people at its center in a way that folks are fairly comfortable with and also are willing to come along for the ride on. That's not easy to do. So I live in the Midwest. One of the things that is very visible and very present up there is the fact that the steel industry collapsed in the 80s. It's still something that people are very aware of. It's still something that has big ramifications for those communities. Chicago still is, I think, 600,000 people shy of its peak population. Like, that's the biggest city in the region, but there's a lot of things like that where we've experienced depopulation, job loss, lots of other kinds of things associated with the loss of this industry. I don't want to say that's the only reason, but it is very present and very politically relevant. But the point being is we know what happens when we don't plan ahead for giant industrial changes, and it's not good. This is another example that's a little bit more relevant to the energy transition particularly, but when we think about unplanned transition, one of the most obvious examples of this in the United States so far is what's been happening to the coal industry over the last decade and a half or so. So this picture is from a strike from a few years ago in Kentucky, basically at a coal company that went bankrupt one morning, which is very common in the coal industry. I think in the last 15 years, every coal company in the United States has gone bankrupt at least once. That's a fairly stark statistic and is also one that's always interesting in the context of like university endowment divestments. If you were invested in coal, I have questions for you. But point being, in this particular case, this was probably one of the more egregious times that we saw this very, very disruptive way that a bankruptcy can work. So here, what ended up happening was the coal miners who had found out that they'd been laid off essentially blockaded a train line to prevent the coal that they had mined in the days prior from leaving before they got paid. But essentially people were, again, fired, not paid for the work that they had already done, which is illegal, and in some cases actually had money clawed back out of their accounts through direct deposit mechanisms, which I have never heard about in other contexts. But this was a fairly serious example of this, but not that uncommon from kind of a vibes perspective on how this has actually worked in coal in the US. So as one more statistic on this, within the coal mining context, between 2012 and 2017, looking at 4 coal companies specifically, there were many more, but this was an analysis focused on 4, about $5 billion in pensions and environmental remediation funds were discharged through bankruptcy courts. What that kind of shows is that when we let transition happen through bankruptcy, through these big shocks, and through kind of an unplanned mechanism, you end up losing access to a lot of the kinds of things that are fairly important. So again, basically saying we don't have any money anymore, we can't pay people's pensions, we can't pay people's healthcare, and we can't meet our environmental remediation obligations. All of those costs get socialized through bankruptcy, and some of them never get picked back up again. Massively, massively disruptive to these communities. The other kind of scary thing about this, because we've started to see similar behaviors in a lot of the rest of the fossil industries, is that the coal industry is actually quite small comparatively. So at the period that these statistics are from, the number of people employed in the coal mining industry was about 50,000 or so. The number of those who are actually miners was more on the order of maybe 10,000 or so. Now it's more like 7 or 8. But other fossil industries are much bigger. And so when you think about the amount of disruption that can come from allowing these things just to go bankrupt overnight, the scale of what that looks like is actually much more significant when we start to spread it beyond coal. The other piece of that is that coal is one of many fuels that we use for electricity generation, and that's pretty much all we use it for, a little bit on the steel side. But in terms of disruption to society more broadly, there were other fuels able to kind of pick it up when a coal mine would close or when a coal plant would close. That's not really what we would expect to see if you started to see like all of the refineries starting to go bankrupt overnight without coordination on the demand side. So suddenly we don't have refining anymore. That's a really bad outcome. We started to see what that looks like in a couple of instances during COVID. So a couple of the California refineries went out. I think one decided to reorganize as a biofuels refinery, maybe hasn't yet. But a few examples like that where these kinds of sudden shocks, particularly in private industries that are not subject to kind of a positive obligation to serve the way that a utility is really dangerous and is something that we could probably expect to see more of if we don't think about this from a more coordinated perspective. And yeah, the other point about this, as I'm sure people realize, is that a lot of energy jobs are pretty location specific. And so when this happens, it tends to be incredibly impactful for the host community. This is not the kind of thing that's sort of evenly geographically distributed. Another one that I think probably a lot of people in this room feel very viscerally is that when we don't have planned transitions, we're not necessarily thinking about which system is being expected to provide which services. So obviously, this is the chart from when ERCOT almost went down a couple of years ago, or almost went down harder than it did. Basically, the kind of post-mortem on this suggested that people expected the natural gas plants to be able to pick up the slack when things started to get really squirrely. They didn't. Largely for ice reasons, political reasons, governance reasons, like there's a lot of ways you can think about this, but the point is there was an expectation within the way that we were thinking about how the power system would work that did not turn out to be true in a physical sense. That's a really extreme example, but I think the overall point is when you start thinking about transitions, there are a lot of implicit assumptions that we make about what's available and what is actually doing the kinds of services that we're not necessarily paying for directly. So in the power sector, we think about this as ancillary services in many cases, and when you have a system that's almost entirely thermal, you can make some assumptions about what's going on there, even if you don't have an explicit market to ensure that you have, some amount of voltage control, some amount of inertia in the system, these kinds of things. If we start to move into a situation where we see very, very different technology profiles that are, again, dynamic, so once you get used to having to manage them, they change again, and are dealing with a lot of the impacts of climate change, which are also novel operating conditions and probably pushing some of these systems outside of their design parameters, you end up in cases where, without being very, very careful and planning for what exactly you're expecting from each part of the system during those events, you are going to get outages, you are going to get failures. And so this is kind of a bid, again, for much more managed coordination and a lot of really deep thinking about what is it that we're actually relying on from each of these systems in our kind of visions for the future. I was mentioning this to some people earlier today, but I think the other really big example of this that I see in a lot of modeling is there are many assumptions that kind of far out mid-century, maybe post-mid-century. There's some natural gas left in the system that can provide backup for power systems in those times when you have like very little sun, very little wind, midwinter, it's really cold, everyone's trying to turn on their heat. A lot of the models kind of assume that there's some gas there, so you don't necessarily need an alternative because you can just use that gas system. Those models are not necessarily talking very much about, again, whether there are still pipelines at that point, who's paying for them, whether they have met minimum pressures, those types of things, and also specifically not thinking about the point that in those kinds of scenarios, the assumption is that you're asking systems that you don't run very often to perform under the absolutely most difficult conditions that there are. You probably haven't tested them in years, and your people that are running them probably don't have direct experience doing that anymore in parts of these systems. And so thinking about things like that, again, solvable, but if we don't actually plan for it, you can't just assume that we have that kind of knowledge. I think a lot of this point about human capital in the system is actually also a little bit under considered. So we may have people that are very good at managing emergency conditions for certain kinds of systems now. We will need that kind of expertise more, again, as technology dynamics change, as climate change occurs, but we probably are also losing that expertise in a lot of the most safety critical systems that we have unless we're very conscious of making sure that we have it still. So this is not just a technical problem, it's also an expertise problem. But again, solvable, we just have to actually bother to do it. An overall point here too is that when we think about a transition away from a fossil fuel-based energy system, we're talking about high hazard infrastructures. We know, again, from experience that abandoning high hazard infrastructure is a bad idea. We end up with a lot of very severe environmental contamination, blighted areas that have like big abandoned industrial facilities that maybe are not addressed, and frankly, like active danger situations in many cases if you don't decommission these things appropriately. We have a lot of examples of this happening for many, many years. This is some work that I did a few years ago up in the Bakken in North Dakota, just kind of talking to people about what their experience of boom and bust cycles was in that context, and something that we heard a lot throughout that project of just asking people like, what has this been like for you? What is it like to be part of one of these host communities? It was just this sense of complete unplanned abandonment that was happening fairly consistently. So one person saying in response to a sitting where someone had gone bankrupt, that they just left the building there and said, here's the keys, bank, here you go. This is how you're gonna pay your, my loan off. Another one starts talking about how basically a lot of things that people were willing to tolerate previously when things were still good, there's a lot of employment, a lot of money flowing. So like air pollution, nausea issues, those sorts of things started to become a lot less tolerable when the industry actually went away and nobody was benefiting from it anymore, but neither was anyone actually addressing those problems that were kind of abandoned with the infrastructure. So we have a lot of examples of this and a lot of fairly recent history with what this actually looks like that suggests to us we need to do this better. One of the sort of scary things about all of this, and I get this question a lot, is give me some really good examples of when we've done this super well. There aren't a lot. But we do, I think, have enough of an opportunity, enough of a timeline, and enough expertise about the things that we know do work at small scale to actually at least try to do this better this time. In general, again, phasing out high hazard industries requires a lot of particular care and a lot of attention. I've already kind of brought up this example of pipelines, but when you think about like the main transmission pipelines for the natural gas system, in this case, superimposed on the main basins in yellow, this infrastructure goes a lot of places. It goes near a lot of people's homes. Obviously, this is just the transmission system, but if you looked at the distribution system as well, a lot of us have a gas pipeline going directly to our homes. If you think about a transition where all of that is just sort of abandoned, maybe not with a ton of oversight, you really start to be looking at a serious, serious safety situation that, again, can be avoided as long as we plan for it, but we do need to plan for it. Similarly, with a lot of what we're starting to see in terms of dynamics between mines and plants and things like that, not only do you have to be kind of conscious about just what infrastructure is actually doing, but you have to be conscious of how they interact with each other. So one dynamic that I have been waiting for about a decade now, and we're starting to kind of see it, is historically we've seen coal plants closing and then causing mines to close. We're starting to get into a paradigm where mines will no longer be able to meet minimum viable scale and will start forcing power plants to close too. When those actions are not coordinated, people get caught kind of flat-footed in terms of where they think their supplies are coming from, and that starts to be really challenging. Again, solvable, but we actually have to bother to solve it. The other aspect of this that I haven't talked as much about is that in all of this, when you think about transitioning, the new system actually also has to be ready if we're going to successfully close the old one. So you can't just shut everything down with no backup and no new system ready to take over. That actually turns out also to be challenging, but is also, I think, a very good argument for more coordination and more planning on this. But for context, when we think about exactly how much infrastructure we're talking about in moving from, again, an 80% fossil-based system to a basically 0% fossil-based system over the next several decades, one of the key aspects of this that we generally expect to see is a trend toward electrification. The idea being you can make electricity out of clean fuels, and therefore the more that you can do directly with electricity, the more able you are to integrate those fuels. What that looks like in a couple of different models, so this is one of the Princeton reports, but this is also supported by like the EMF37 study, which has slightly different ranges, but is basically the same conclusion, is that we are probably moving from about a terawatt of installed capacity needs in the United States for electricity to somewhere between, in this model, 2.5 and 6 or so. The EMF37 harmonization study, I think, comes up with about 5 to 8 terawatts. But we are talking about a massive, massive amount of new infrastructure as well, all simultaneous, during which you need people working in both industries, you need coordination in both industries, etc. So basically that looks like building a ton of power plants. The thing about renewables also is that they are less energy dense. Like you can argue that nukes don't have this problem, but we also haven't demonstrated that we can build those in less than 15 years. So we'll see. But basically, we're talking about building more power plants per unit of capacity, um, and also probably having lower capacity factors per power plant, although the wind power sector at this point has a capacity factor pretty similar to the natural gas fleet, which I think is interesting. But overall point is it's a lot of individual siting decisions, it's a lot of individual projects, and this is something that we're going to have to get good at because we're already seeing problems with this at the level of kind of 10% penetration of renewables into the system when we're looking at something that might be as high as, 800% of the penetration of the system, again, within hypothetically a couple of decades. There are ways to manage this better. So lots and lots of opposition. What a lot of the social science research finds is largely related to people not really understanding what the point is. So if you're building out a bunch of infrastructure, but you can't articulate an overall vision for what the transition actually looks like, you can't articulate an overall climate plan that kind of explains why this is going to do anything, people are often fairly suspicious that this is worth it. So will often be much more oppositional when they have not kind of seen a vision of why this is going to be helpful in the long run. There's a huge amount of support for the idea that more information about plans and more information about kind of what the strategy is actually quite helpful in engaging and deliberating in public. So people in general are much more supportive when it's clear that there's actually a plan, which again kind of points to this question of planning and coordination, which we know we need from a technological perspective, but we also probably need from a social perspective as well. This is another example of just like how people talk about this. I know it's kind of small, but major point is these were some comments that people made in Gillette, Wyoming in response to a hearing about a climate policy, in this case, the Clean Power Plan. But this is a community of about 30,000 people that produces roughly 40% of the United States' coal from about less than 20 mines. Huge, huge mines, very coal-dependent community. The other industries that they have are essentially oil and gas, with some ranching nearby as well. But what people said at this hearing, which was very much oriented around being pretty pro-coal, was essentially, we're going to see from this climate plan that we're going to be asked to make a ton of sacrifices, but when you tell me what the benefits of actually doing this are, I don't see what those are. Essentially saying the Clean Power Plan wasn't going far enough to be worth it, and that if you are going to have to go through all of these disruptions, we'd actually prefer to see something a little bit more effective. So kind of an interesting take, a lot of language about sacrifice. So like, we have made sacrifices to ensure this energy system is working. You need to demonstrate that these sacrifices are going to be worth it. It's actually a pretty consistent theme, even for people that were ultimately opposing the climate plan. But it wasn't so much like, we don't believe this is worth it. It's basically like, this plan doesn't go as far as I would need to see it go in order to be willing to do the kinds of things that you're asking me to do. So my last major point is just kind of around how we think about policy. Generally speaking, when we talk about just transition in a really academic perspective, that term is very oriented around labor transitions, and there's a lot of good reasons for this. So it kind of originated in the 70s and 80s when we started to see a lot of job loss in atomic and chemical sectors, largely as environmental laws started to get underway. People were essentially saying, if we're going to get rid of entire industries in order to support a broader public goal, then you need to actually make sure that those workforces are taken care of and that you're not basically pulling people's jobs out from under them. That's the origin of the term, and so we still see quite a lot of attention in policy to really, really focusing on fossil labor forces. That's a good thing in many ways, and I think that I do really point out in many cases that we actually need special attention to fossil workforces because we need people who know how to do this during this very difficult management period when the industries are getting smaller. You don't actually want people abandoning the industries, but you do need people who are kind of on board with the idea that this transition is happening. That all said, you end up in some very, very challenging contexts when that's the only focus in transition. We know that with the fossil industries in particular, these are relatively whiter workforces, they're relatively wealthier workforces, have often benefited from many decades of these industries being big job providers. I grew up in an oil family, like this is a thing for real. It's an important thing to be paying attention to, but also in the face of climate change, when we think about who else actually needs to be addressed and who really needs to be taken care of from a policy perspective as we move forward, a more universal focus and one that is really attentive to the most vulnerable, but also making sure that everybody has the services that we need is probably going to be more effective in the long term. What we see right now, though, is a lot of policies that are very focused on what happens to fossil host communities, fossil workforces, et cetera. Again, important, but not enough, basically. So for the next couple minutes, just to conclude, I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like in certain policy contexts in a very direct way. So in general, the point being that care is actually pretty necessary to ensure that our policies align both with people's needs, so making sure people have health care, have housing, have food, have all of these things that we need, but also is ensuring that the climate actually goes somewhere. An example of a policy that doesn't really do this is basically the way that we handle carbon capture in the United States at this point is very focused on kind of continuity of industries. There are some good arguments for doing it that way, but there's also a lot of perverse incentives. Part of the reason that a lot of these policies have so much support is because they're very focused on ensuring that workforces don't need to transition and that there's still a lot of opportunities in places that are pretty fossil oriented. Again, there are good reasons to think about it that way, but you need to be really careful that that's actually aligned with your ultimate goals as well. So in a paper that came out this past March, we were looking specifically at the carbon oxide storage credit, 45Q, and essentially concluded that if you really look at this in the context of the way that the law was written and that the subsidy was created, in a profit maximizing setting, US CCS on fossil power would probably incentivize increases in emissions at very, very high cost. So we find at the high end maybe an 80% increase relative to the counterfactual in terms of fossil power emissions over the period of analysis, which I think goes up to 2050 or so, at a cost of about $4 trillion relative to business as usual. There's a couple of reasons for this that I'm super happy to talk about after, if anyone is really interested in the details. But point being, we have this policy that's really oriented around kind of fossil industry preservation that does not really succeed at allowing people to transition in a way that's ultimately going to be that sound, but also doesn't really do that much for the climate. So what this looks like is 45Q essentially incentivizes and pays for individual units of carbon dioxide being stored underground. Effectively, that makes it a production tax credit, which means that you are incentivized to make more CO2 so that you can store it. But because of that, it actually ends up, in the way that it was written, increasing probably both the lifespan and the capacity factor of the facilities that it's applied to. So in this particular paper, we went through a bunch of scenarios to kind of see what that would look like. So some looking at no change in capacity factor, no lifespan extensions, and then a couple of other variations of that, and kind of compared it to a policy that is focused on setting retirement deadlines for these facilities that allow communities to have enough time to plan for them, but also have like an ultimate deadline for closure. And basically what that shows, at least in our model, which is relatively consistent with some empirical data that's come out since then, is that even in a circumstance where you have no increase in lifespans, this yellow highlighted one, and no increase in capacity factor, where your costs are just the value of the tax credit, so $85 a ton in this case, you only get an abatement of about 24% relative to a business as usual case. You end up paying about $500 billion for that, and it ends up being about as effective as some of these closure deadlines. So requiring the coal fleet to close by 2030, or requiring the entire fossil fleet to close by 2050, both, or 2035 rather, both give you roughly similar benefits, but at much, much lower cost. So overall point being, there are a lot of different ways that we think about structuring policies to manage this transition, some of which are more conscious of actually needing to make the transition than others, but the incentive structures are not always aligned that well. So sort of a cautionary tale, and something that a lot of us are looking very carefully at for the hydrogen tax credit guidance that is supposed to come out later this year as well. Overall point being, though, the mid-transition in general is probably a multi-decade process that takes a lot of really significant coordination to do successfully, and particularly because we expect to see both climate and technological change challenging the dynamics of this. We have a lot of ability to plan for it. We have a lot of ability to solve many of these problems, but we actually have to do it. So I'll stop there, and thank you all for spending part of the afternoon with me.